really, we're really fortunate to have someone like this in Hawaii, who is world famous, and who actually helps um, begin defining simultaneous interpreting as it is today. And he has I don't want to take away any more time from him, so I want him to explain himself. But just so we know the room, any of you actually done simultaneous interpreting before? Or would like to in the future, maybe? Okay, so they're all shy. That tells us who they are. But anyway, I don't know if she's always helping the Center for Interpretation and Translation Studies, which is where we're from. And Lucia Aranda is our director, if you don't know that. And Andrew works for as well, works in our office as a GA. But we've started this series to help people understand more about what the center is all about and what kind of training there is. And it's amazing when you actually see the underworld of simultaneous interpreting, what's happening here in Hawaii and around the world. So without further ado, we really want to thank you and for being here. And
thank you, Sue.
Ask them to sit.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really nice to be here. You know, the UH and the East-West Center, where I am now, are my second homes in many ways. And the Center for Interpretation and Translation also was beginning at the time, you know, when I came to Hawaii. Let me start by making some autobiographical comments. I mean, the key question is how did you get to Nuremberg? Maybe I should point out that I was unusually young when I joined the IMT, the International Military Tribunal, main trials. So in a way, in my life experiences and my both personal as well as professional life, really is a transition of 2 centuries, the 20th century and the 21st century. So in a sense, I reflect some of the characteristics of these centuries. If we start with the 20th century, I don't think there's any development, any event, anything significant that has influenced people as much as the 20th century, the 2 world wars. If you ask yourself, and if you speak to your own parents, if they're still alive, or grandparents, or uncles, or aunts, and so on, I would say that there's hardly any family, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, that has not been affected in some ways by World War II, whether it was military service, whether it was conscription for service, for a whole, the course of lives of literally billions of people have been affected by World War II. So as I said, I'm a transition person. And how did I get to Nuremberg, and how did my life and my career get started? I was unusually young at the time. I lived in London before that. I studied in England, both actually secondary studies, but I came originally from Austria, from Vienna. I had relatives in England, and at that, my life was influenced by something that was called the Anschluss. Anschluss is a German word that means annexation. There was the annexation of Austria to Germany, where the German armed forces came into Austria. It's a controversial subject, how they were greeted, how they were received in Austria coming as an army. Actually, with a great deal of jubilation. It's easy to generalize. Some Austrian nationalists were very, very affected and negative about it, but a lot of the young people, in a sense, celebrated what they felt was a new wave of German culture, because obviously Austria, the language of Austria in the arts and the sciences and everything else, is really basically German. The differences have to do more with pronunciation and intonation rather than with the actual range of vocabulary. Well, I was right after the Anschluss. I came to England. I continued my studies in England, but war broke out in 1939, and I at that time I had lived through or experienced the London Blitz. The Blitz is the area of the bombardments from Germany that was coming over into England. I was in London during the time when the so-called V1s and V2 bombs, almost like drones, came over London. The Blitz would be night-long air raids going on for months and months, where there was a blackout at night, and all night long you'd experience anti-aircraft fire, planes flying overhead. So however, what was happening is that as the war continued, at first with success from the German point of view of the invasion of Holland and France and many European countries, and then around 1944, the tide of the war, of World War II, was changing in favor of the Allies. And the question then arose, at that time also the news had come out all over the world of the atrocities that were being committed, the beginning of the evidence of the Holocaust, where literally millions of people were exterminated. I think we're aware of that here as young people, as part of the history, if you read about World War II. Of course, except for myself, that I'm a bit older, but the majority of you were either not yet born or were children when it happened. But then the question arose, what should be done when the war is over, when there's capitulations? What should be the impact of that in terms of the Allies who were the victors in World War II? So far as my career, my experience was concerned at that point, as I said, as the tide of the war was changing in favor of the Allies, the war was about to end, and there was urgent need, immediate need for linguists to deal with the disarmament of Germany, and also to deal with the logistics of moving into Germany. So in London, there was some leaflets or some notices came out that there was a search for linguists to help with this rather urgent need. I signed, I mean, they had to be identified as bona fide linguists. I signed up as an interested person. Within an incredibly short time, I was in an American uniform. I think in a matter of weeks, I looking very smart in the so-called Eisenhower jacket and khaki pants that we had at that time. And within 2 weeks, I was aboard an aircraft, so-called the DC-3, the Douglas aircraft, the C-47, which is an ancient, actually it's still flying today, sitting in one of the bucket seats, flying to the continent, and then joining a battalion that was involved. It was the 9th U.S. Air Force battalion, and I was assigned to that battalion. Well, for a while it was chaotic. The war had just ended. There were convoys of people going in different directions. I had a driver in a jeep had come for me, and it took us several days before I managed to get in touch with the battalion to which I was assigned. And then and what happened there as the war had ended was, for me, was my first contact with Americans. And it was an interesting experience. It was quite attractive to me to see the informality of the young GIs and even of the officers. And I was kind of adopted by them. And it was an interesting time. And on the one hand, there had been the tragedy of World War II, but on the other hand, there was this infusion of enthusiasm, of young GIs coming, being in Germany at the time. Well, one thing, just by the way, I was asked in the battalion whether I would be interested in teaching some German, because they're going to be in the German. I said, no, I have no experience at all in that, but why not? I'd be interested in doing that. So it was announced that German classes would start, and the first day we had taken over a huge educational classroom building, and that room, maybe as big as this room, where the German classes were to be held, for the beginning, were absolutely filled with people. We had to bring in more chairs so that people could sit down. And I started in the first lesson or two. The GIs were primarily interested in greetings, to saying good morning, good evening, and then how to address girls. Can I walk with you? Can we have a conversation? And as they learned these expressions, that was all they needed. So after 1 or 2 or 3 lessons, they had enough of that. They knew those basic expressions, and then the ones that were left were maybe 3 or 4 students who were actually interested in the language itself. But now, in 1945, as the war ended, as I mentioned before, the question arose how to proceed with bringing the leaders of Nazi Germany to justice. It was the preparations for the trial, and the trial itself, especially the big one, international military trial, was a media event. It was important news all over, in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, everywhere else. So that was very important, and the decision was made that the trials were to be conducted in 4 languages. In, of course, the German language for the accused or the defendants, French, Russian, German, and English. Now, to conduct these trials on a consecutive basis in translation would have been unthinkably boring and difficult for just to think in terms of any given sentence. That if it were to be interpreted consecutively each time, it just would have taken an incredibly long time. So something had to be done in order to make it possible for these trials to be handled in an efficient way. You know the English proverb, necessity is the mother of invention. If something is absolutely necessary, something happens, some vision is created in order to deal with that issue. Now, it's difficult to pinpoint one individual who was responsible for the idea of simultaneous interpretation, but maybe the man who had most of that vision and was very important for that role was a man called a Frenchman by birth, but who had lived in the United States, became in World War II became a colonel. He worked for a while as an interpreter for General Eisenhower, and his name was Léon Doster. And his vision really got the idea started that to conduct the trials on a simultaneous basis would deal with that dilemma that we faced. And now the question arose, who would be the individuals who could be employed or could be found to do that job, and where would they be? And I was, in my case, I was, as I said, I was unusually young, But as I worked and stayed with my battalion, we came close to a city called Nuremberg, which is close to Bavaria, and the decision was made that Nuremberg would be the site for the international trial. It had a large, we called it the Palace of Justice. It had a very large courtroom. At that time, also, there were the engineers. When it came to the idea of simultaneous interpreting, of course, the most important factor, and I'll speak about that, has to do with the individuals who would be capable of meeting that challenge. The other factor was the factor of technology. What kind of technology could be used in order to make that possible? And working, in other words, electronically with language channels. So we really needed, I won't go into the technical details here. I spoke on that a little more in San Antonio in Texas, where I spoke at the American Translators Association. But in other words, there were some technical needs that had to be met and overcome. And then you had to find actually linguists, people who were perfectly bilingual. I was with that battalion, but I heard rumors that something was going to be happening in Nuremberg. So I asked one of the drivers in my battalion to take me to Nuremberg. I introduced myself to the so-called adjutant general, who were working with staff in making all of the preparations for the trial. And this man told me, we needed people like yourself with that kind of a background, because the idea is to have a bilingual background, beginning with one's studies and upbringing and life in a given city where the language could be assumed. So I was received sort of with open arms, but when I went back to my battalion and asked my colonel whether that transfer could be made, he said, no, nothing doing. We need you here. I'm not interested. He was a regular army guy, very gruff type of individual, and he just wouldn't listen to me. So there's nothing I could do. Obviously, I mean, I was here. This young fellow is assigned to that battalion. I couldn't persuade him. Well, what happened was that within 2 or 3 weeks, orders came, I guess, from the U.S. headquarters in Frankfurt and also from England, for me and the other people too, because the war had ended, to be sent back to England. And I had received orders in my hand that on the following day to report to an air base in Frankfurt and to fly back to London. At that point, I made a decision that was to influence the rest of my life, because I realized that if I went to Frankfurt the following day, I had to spend the night before that at an air base. And if I got on that plane and went to England, there was no way I could ever get back to Germany, because the channels of command were very chaotic. There was no possibility of getting back. So I made a decision not to get on that plane. By that time, I'd lost my driver and jeep had left. I was in uniform and I had a duffel bag. So I went out to the Autobahn. The Autobahn is the major highway there. And hitchhiking when you're in uniform is very, very easy. Very simple, no problem. People stopped right away. Took me back to Nuremberg. And from that point on, I was the task at hand was so important and so dynamic that I almost didn't give it any thought that I'd left that battalion and I had literally gone AWOL, absent without leave. In fact, and this is a byproduct, about a month later, an MP, a military police captain and a sergeant, had found my traces and came to Nuremberg and had realized that I was there. But I had no problems whatsoever. Why not? Because the Nuremberg trials, the trials that were to begin, were the most important event that was going on, that it had priority over everything else. And the fact that I was needed there just solved that issue. And I joined the staff of the International Military Tribunal of the War Crimes trial. Now, there were various phases involved. The first phase in my job as an interpreter had to do with the pre-trial interrogations. You know, when you build a case in law, I mean, it's a question of preparing documentary evidence, and preparing human evidence, and preparing the interpretation, the trial proceedings, and so on. And the challenge was to, as I mentioned, for not only to have the technical ability to have language channels electronically, 4 different channels with earphones and so on, but you needed above all the human element, the human beings who would be able to do that. And it's when I think back now to the staff that was involved, the translation division, the translation staff that dealt with document translations, the interrogation staff, and the ones who were the people who were going to start the simultaneous interpretation. We dealt with a variety of individuals and a variety of background. For one thing, as far as I'm concerned, most of them were much older. Some of them were professional translators and linguists. Some of them were in different kinds of professions. But we had to determine whether they would be able to meet that demand. Now, here's one thing that we found out very soon about the human qualities of a simultaneous interpreter, that one could not be a perfectionist. Because when you're a perfectionist, and of course it's very good and very important to be a perfectionist if you're a translator of a book or a scientific treatise or anything else, because then you can sit in your office with a number of good dictionaries, thinking over a sentence or a phrase in many ways until you came up with the right kinds of things. But in a simultaneous interpreting system, you're in a kind of a glass partition with a microphone in front of you. Your earphones were on you. In my case, I was on the English microphone. In other words, I was listening to German and speaking English. So in other words, I was in the English booth. And in that booth, that microphone was the channel into English. That means German into English. I was one of those. French into English, Russian into English. Because when somebody was speaking English, like Lord Justice Lawrence, the presiding judge, obviously he would speak English. So at that time, the English booth was silent. There were no interpreters there because the original, we call it the verbatim version, came through. But then when the response came in German, then as I heard the German, I would be speaking English simultaneously. So in other words, we needed people who were flexible, who were able to respond to stimuli, language stimuli, immediately. And it's, as I said, we needed at that point to determine who would be able to handle that. Well, first a comment on document translation. There were literally thousands of documents that had come in and needed to be dealt with as a documentary evidence in relation to the indictment, aggressive war, crimes against humanity, war crimes, conspiracies, all of these things. Many of them were in documentary documentary evidence. And then there was the testimony of individuals. Now, Adolf Hitler, the Führer, had committed suicide. Some of the key people like Himmler and others had also had committed suicide or had died. But so the 21 defendants who were there at the International Military Tribunal, they represented the leadership of Germany as it existed at that time. So the first phase had to do with the pre-trial interrogation phase. I was involved in that. I was one of the few who was involved at the trials from the very beginning with the pre-trial phase in preparation for the trial. The trials themselves, that was number one, the International Military Tribunal in 4 languages, and then 12 subsequent proceedings. So in my case, I was involved at Nuremberg from 1945 to 1949, in other words, 4 years. Now, when it came to documentary evidence, as I said, there was one important need, and we called those people research analysts. There was no time, it was impossible to deal with all of these documents and to do it in a timely fashion when you were in a great deal of time pressure. So there was a group of linguists who were not simultaneous interpreters, who were not working at the mic, but they had the important task of going through key documents and lifting portions of the documents that are relevant to the trial. In other words, we call them research analysts because they needed enough historical knowledge so that they could understand what these documents conveyed and how they would fit into the strategy of the trial itself. So that was one. The other thing was the actual pre-trial interrogation, where the defendants, the accused, were brought up into interrogation rooms, and in that interrogation room there was a seat for the defendant or for a key witness. There was an allied lawyer, could be from Great Britain or from France, but mostly from Great Britain and from the United States. And then there was the interpreter. I served during many pre-trial interrogation phases. Just to give you some idea, just by the way, when I'm asked what affected you most about your experience in Nuremberg, I mention the pre-trial experience. Why is that? Because something was going on there that was unique in history. It's unique in the sense that the leaders of a nation had suffered total defeat, the total capitulation of Germany, and during those pre-trial phases, these were times when these leaders of the nation were asked to articulate and explain what their role was, what the conditions were under which they lived. In a way, you can make the analogy to an autopsy. When a doctor conducts an autopsy, the patient is dead, but during the autopsy, the doctor finds what is the malignancy, what kind of illness, in this case, what kind of crimes were committed and under what circumstances. So that made the pre-trial interrogation as something very, very unique and very special. Now, some of those pre-trial interpreters actually worked later on in the courtroom as a simultaneous interpreter. I was during the early phases of the International Military Tribunal, I had a number of functions. I mentioned the pre-trial interrogations, but there were also the subsequent proceedings. For example, one of the subsequent trials that took place at Nuremberg was the trial of medical doctors who conducted experiments on human beings. And I was one of the key interpreters on the English microphone. And I want to mention that because that was one of an example of a very difficult challenge, because it dealt with medical vocabulary, with a great deal of specialties where the defendants would try to persuade the courtroom and the world that they were doing something that was in the interest of human science. They tried to but for the interpreter, as I think back to that challenge, very often the medical terminology was very strange and very, very difficult for me. And what saved us, as it were, we called it in the medical trial, was that medical terminology has roots in Latin. So there are Latin roots. So the difference between, say, German and French and English in dealing with medical testimony has to do a lot with the pronunciation. In other words, the roots would be the same, whether it was German, English, or French, or anything else, but the pronunciation of these roots, would. So there were many times when I would be working at the microphone, not really understanding, what all of that meant, but managing, so to speak, by just following those words and using the appropriate translation. So as I said, I worked at the International Military Tribunals for the entire time, for the major military tribunal, and I had a variety of functions there too. For example, I dealt as a linguist aiding the court reporters. The court reporter in the trial takes down the testimony on stenotype or stenograph. But the court reporters at Nuremberg, they were in 4 languages. The court reporters for English, for French, for German, and for Russian. I had a support role for the English language court reporters who were taking down the testimony as it came through in English, and they were stymied, and they had the problem of proper words, the names of ranks, the names of cities, of ranks, of all kinds of proper terminology that really cannot be translated, and needed to be, in my case, needed to be expressed. So what was happening is that at times I was seated in a tier beneath the judges. The court reporters would come in every half an hour, taking the takes, and I would be listening very intently. And whenever a word comes up, which is a proper German word, which has to do with a rank, as I said, or a city, or a place, or a name, and so on, I would write all of these things down clearly, so that when the next turn came, the court reporter had to leave. That court reporter, he or she, would then reach back. I was in a tier right below the judge, and take a sheet of paper from me, where all of these problematic terms had been written down, so they could go back to their office and do the transcription. Now, what in retrospect is quite amazing and I think impressive is that at the end of a trial day, the transcript was available in 4 languages, in English, French, German, and Russian. Now, it was not a polished transcript. It was impossible to have that become a polished transcript. But the essence was there. And when I did this function, I would be when I would be at the mic speaking English. Then I would go after a recess, after an hour and a half. I would go to my office and compare what came through on the microphone verbatim and what came out from the court reporter, and make sure that no mistakes were made. But after all, it was a trial dealing with life and death, and so it was important that revision process took place. Right now, thank you. Right now, interpreters don't stay in the courtroom or in front of the mic as long as we did at the time. I would sometimes be an hour and a half, which is really far too long. It's interesting to say something how you feel when you're under that pressure. You're sitting, there's the mic in front of you, you have television, you have reporters, you know, in a sense the world is watching you. You can't make a mistake. It's very, very important. And it's what occurred, and it's hard to go into all of the details of this, is that sometimes when you're in the rhythm of interpreting into the microphone, you reach a trance-like condition where, when I say like a trance, is you enter into the dialogue, into the testimony, and you listen to it, and you speak English, but the whole thing is, you're so focused, and there's so much pressure that in a way you've done all of that work, but when you go outside into the corridor and the hallway during a recess, and this happens to me often, and somebody comes to me and asks, well, what happened in the courtroom at that time? I was unable to respond. I was doing it, I was in this trance, but yet when somebody asked me what happened there, it was difficult to respond. We had a lot of language challenges. How many of you are students or speakers of German? Anyone here? You're one of them. Well, if you study German, if you know something about the structure of German language, the verb is at the end of a subordinate clause. And the more academic, the more complex a speaker is, the further the verb is removed from the subject. On the other hand, when you speak English, you need the verb immediately, because the verb is the root of an expression, of a sentence. So if, in my case, for example, in order to speak English, I needed the verb right away. But the witness of the defendant, his turn with this verb doesn't come until quite a time after. So, and you can't wait for the verb. If you can't wait, and there's a breakdown. And so we devised a method to deal with that challenge, which we formed sentence segments, adjectival sentence, that allowed me to keep going with those short segments until the verb is heard. And then when the verb is heard, the verb could then combine everything that has preceded it. Now, when I try to explain this to you and talk about it, it sounds very complex and very difficult. And it actually, once you get the hang of it, so to speak, it isn't that difficult, and it's one way of keeping going. Now, the judge, especially Chief Justice Lawrence, who was the British Chief Justice, and other judges in subsequent proceedings, were very, very helpful to the interpreters. We had a kind of a traffic light system. When when there was excitement in the courtroom, and that happened from time to time, where people were speaking at the same time because it was very dramatic testimony. When people are speaking at the same time, the simultaneous system breaks down. When you just can't interpret simultaneously when there are a lot of people speaking. So at that point, there was a traffic light system, like an orange light, and in front of every desk, everywhere, prosecution, defense, judges, and so on, and accused. If a situation arose where people were speaking at the same time, then the orange light would go on, and the Chief Justice would ask the speakers to repeat what they had said, and to slow down. When there's a mechanical breakdown, which didn't happen too often, thankfully, but it did happen from time to time, at that point the judge would declare a recess so that the technical problem could be solved, and you could go on. So these were some of the challenges that we had. Life at Nuremberg during the trials was something we all aware that we are living in historic time, historic event. But there was a social life going on at the same time. For example, in my case, I became close friends with an American court reporter who actually hailed from Hawaii. I had no idea where Hawaii was or that existed, but she was a court reporter. She had worked in a law office in San Francisco, where a call went out for lawyers who were needed at the trials. So she answered, and she was a reporter. In fact, I write about that in my autobiography. This is a long story; it doesn't quite belong into this setting, but we became close friends. About 3 years later, into the trials, we married. We married in France, in Paris, and we had another year in Europe. And then the idea, of course, that she wanted me to visit Hawaii and see her friends and her family and so on. I mean, we had no thought of settling down or having a career and so on. But anyway, then there's that story goes on. It's not a different story because it happened in the same way, but it doesn't belong into the origins and challenges of simultaneous interpreting. But you can read about it. I wrote an autobiography, which is just a year ago was translated into this is the English version, and this also speaks about the origins and challenges of simultaneous interpreting, which we talked about as a chapter in it that dealt with it. But it deals with some of the key defendants, it deals with some of the challenges, and when it comes to it. And then the title of my book is Nuremberg and Beyond. And the beyond really has to do with education. I mean, going backwards with the East-West Center, with the university here too, and with a career at Punahou School, where I founded an international center, which is now active, the Wo Center. So the whole career opened up for me that had its origin at the Nuremberg trials. Now when people ask me, well, what are some of the lessons to be gained from that kind of a career? Well, it seems to me that when you think about a human being's lifeline, when you come from birth to death, rather than a straight line, this is a line that has potential of turning one way, turning another way. In other words, our lifeline has the potential of not being a straight line, going directly from A to B to C, but also a line that offers alternatives, other possibilities. And in my case, this is very, very true. For example, if I had not gone AWOL, as I mentioned before, I would have returned to England at the time. I would probably continue my education had been interrupted, and there could have been some kind of a humdrum existence in a suburb of London somewhere for the rest of my life. Who knows what might have happened? But the point I'm making is that in my case, the lesson that I derive from my lifespan is that there is something to be said for flexibility and for openness, and not to be locked into that line, rather than see alternatives as possibilities and welcome those possibilities, welcome that potential, rather than cut yourself off and staying along that line. One of the things I wanted to mention about the challenges, and then I'd also like to give you opportunities to ask questions, is I mentioned some of the issues in German sentence structure. Another issue dealing with the testimony has to do with deliberate ambiguity in the testimony of the defendants, of the accused. In German, as in other languages too, but I dealt with it in German, there are various ways to use translation, or to use interpretation, where a sentence or a word can be innocuous at all, but it also has another meaning that is incriminatory. And when you're at the microphone, instantly you have to make that decision. Do you want to use the term that is innocuous, that doesn't really, or do you want to use the term that implies guilt or criminality, and so on? Let me give you an example where you had to meet that kind of a challenge. The German sentence, the German testimony was that a segment of the population was seized and transported into camps in Eastern Europe. Okay, the term I used just now was seized. Seized is a loaded word, but so far as I'm concerned, it fit the context. But in German, you can use the word seized, but then there's another word for that means that is erfassen. Erfassen in German is that verb seized. Then there's also a word that is called register. Now, register is innocuous. There's no criminality implied in the word register. Seize is accusatory. So when that happens, defense counsel, I was on a microphone, defense counsel caught that. They caught my term, because many of the defense counsel, if not most of them, spoke some English, and they would on their earphone, they would listen to German and also switch over to English. And when I interpreted seized, they felt I should have interpreted registered, and they made an objection, and then the objection was responded to. What is in a sense amusing about this is that I was on the microphone for about 10 or 15 minutes interpreting my case of my role as an interpreter. In other words, my role was being interpreted, until finally the judge put an end to it, making a judge-like statements that is made all the time among judges, saying the tribunal will take this matter under consideration when the time comes. This is kind of the classic way of responding to that kind of an issue. So the other examples, one example where Chief Justice Jackson, well, he was a chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials when it started. FDR, Roosevelt, had just died before that, and the president of the United States was Truman at that time. And I'm just using my train of thought. We'll come to me in a minute. Yeah, I wanted to give you another example. Another example had to do with the Freimachung des Rheines, meaning the clearing of the Rhine, and then there's a possibility of the liberation of the Rhine population. Now, clearing is innocuous, liberation has a political term, and at that time, the chief prosecutor was interrogating Hermann Göring, the chief of defendants. As I said, the chief prosecutor was Justice Robert Jackson, who was given leave from the U.S. Supreme Court to come to Nuremberg as chief prosecutor, and he was involved in this kind of a dispute between the liberation of the Rhine and the clearing of the Rhine. This is another example of those kinds of things that happen in German. German is a beautiful language, but in its structure, in its vocabulary, it can be quite complex, and a lot of these issues would come up at the time. Let me just make a comment on the meaning of the trials, and then maybe open it up for discussion. When we think of the abyss into which Germany had landed, that led to the slaughter of millions of people, known as the Holocaust, one asks oneself, and it was one of the key questions you ask yourself at Nuremberg, how is it possible that a nation can sink to that abyss, can sink so low? And how is it possible that a nation that is renowned for its great achievements in music, in art, in science, in some of the finest examples of European civilization, has German roots? How is it possible that you have this kind of a cultural contribution coming from a country who's at the same time herding millions of people into gas wagons and exterminating them like that? And when you ask yourself that question, in my book I cited, one gives this answer, perhaps is an important one to give, and that answer is simply when you have a dictatorship situation where there are no checks on power, where a dictator can take over power and do pretty much what the dictator wants. And we see that in the news today, yesterday, we're going to continue to see today. So we come to the conclusion then that it is wrong, it's very wrong to consider this as a German problem only. It needs to be considered as a global, universal problem. So when you're dealing with crimes of that magnitude, to limit those crimes to one nation is not kind of a cop-out, if you use the saying, to shift it all onto one nation and saying the Germans are responsible, but rather than to come to the realization that there is a universal human responsibility, that we all carry within us the seeds of this situation, of this dilemma. there's a great deal has been written of the Nuremberg trials, and the important thing about the Nuremberg trials is its legacy for the future. It declared really for the first time that there is a responsibility of every nation in international law. I go into in a hopeful and understandable way into the legal questions a little bit, but in my book, I really, when I say Nuremberg and beyond, I talk about the responsibility that the Nuremberg trials are giving to the world. It was an important event, probably the most important legal event in the 20th century. And for me, it was a privilege to be involved with it. So let me stop right here and give you an opportunity to ask any questions. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.